So now we're going to go through the process of just a very simple basic sleeve with no alterations. So I'll be adding on seam allowances and hems, and then I'll show you how to do the lining for these sleeve pieces as well. So I've already traced out my block, marked my notches and my grain line here. We are going to add a 4 centimeter hem. I'm doing half scale, and so that's why mine's only 2 centimeters. So we just rule that line along the bottom here. What we then need to do is just make sure, because this isn't a right angle, and we can tell just by looking at it it's not, so we'll need to have a fold back, a turn back on our sleeve hem here. So we'll just go up our 4 centimeters, and then to get the angle, we'll put our pencil on the 4 centimeter point, put our grading ruler along the fold, one of the lines on the ruler on the fold, and then mark it down the bottom, and then use that angle. And it's very slight, but it's just a good habit to get into when you're making your pieces. Same on the other side. So we're going to come up 4 centimeters from the fold, put our pencil on that mark, line up our grading ruler on the fold line, come down to the other side, and then join those together. So really that's the most important thing for your sleeve construction. We will add seam allowances, but before I add the seam allowances, I'm just going to trace out the lining pattern for this top sleeve. So the lining pattern, I do it exactly the same shape. You'll get other techniques showing to add a few millimeters here and do this and do that, but I find that just tracing it out and having the same shape works just fine. So our grain line there. Now what we need to do is the bottom of the sleeve here, which is that this is our sleeve. So you'll see if I turn this out. So the sleeve hem, the lining hem joins onto the top of the hem with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So it means that when these sew together, the bottom of the lining and the top of the sleeve hem need to be the same length. So what we'll do in that instance, just check that I'm doing the same as the pattern here, is we want this to be, we want to mark off the length of this. So this will be the stitch line here. So if I mark that, that'll be 17.2 centimeters full scale. And then we want to measure this, because this is going to sew onto this. We want to make sure they're the same length. So we'll just measure across here. So we'll measure we're going to measure along this line here, because that's our stitch line. We'll actually add a seam allowance below that. So this is 17 centimeters at the moment. This is 17.2. It's only 2 millimeters, but again, it's a good habit to get into. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this, the hem of the lining, just that tiny bit longer. So these are exact measurements. So, and the reason we did that now is because it's easier to do that measuring before you've actually included seam allowances. So, and then we go back. Last thing we need to do is just to add our seam allowances around these pieces. So 1 centimeter seam allowance all the way around. I won't do it to both pieces. I'll just do it on the lining piece. Make sure you transfer your notches onto the cut edges of your pattern. And like I keep saying in these videos, really try and use your grading ruler to help you, with adding your seam allowances on here. Okay, so I'll do this there all the way around. And then I would add, because we've measured this at a centimetre here, the seam allowance. So like I said before too, this is a big seam allowance, so we don't need to add another one onto the hem here, but we need to add seam allowances around the other sides of our top sleeve here. And on the sheet here, the PDF, which will be on Blackboard, we've also got the cutting measurements as well. So cut 1 pair for the top sleeve, 1 pair for the lining, and our name and size. So we've done our top sleeve and our top sleeve lining. Now for the undersleeve, I'm showing you this because there is a bit more of a discrepancy between the bottom of the sleeve and the hem. Oops, my grain line. So we're going to add our hem on here. So we measure down the 4 centimeters. We measure up from the fold line 2 centimeters and have our reference mark on the seam layer, which is the stitch line. Let's go down to the cut line here of the hem and then angle that out. Same on the other side. So we're going up 2 centimeters, using that as our guideline to go down to the cut edge, and then we're going to angle that in. Okay, so that's our hem with the fold back edges there. Now on our lining, trace out the piece. Our grain line. Now what we'll do is we'll measure. So we're going to measure 1 centimetre up from this finished edge here, and that in full scale would be 9.6. Actually, sometimes it's a good idea to actually write that on the piece as well, so you know what the measurement was, just for future reference. And then that line there that we've measured 1 centimetre up is going to sew onto this line because that's going to have a seam allowance added. So we just need to compare the two. So this is 9.4, that would be 9.4, and again it's only a 2 millimetre difference, but we're still going to add that 2 millimetres on. And we're going to make that length longer. And so there we have our lining piece where the hem's the same measurement for when it sews onto the outer hem here. And again, we just need to add seam allowances around this piece. And we can also, like I said before, because this comes to a really long point here, we can actually cut this off shorter, so it's easier to see where it ends when we sew the two together. And then just the seam allowances around here. And remember that we don't need to add a seam allowance onto this bottom edge, it's already included. Notches for our folds, transfer the notches onto the raw edge of your pieces. and our notches onto the raw edges here as well, underarm. And then we have, I've already mentioned the labeling as well. It'll go on these pieces, so that's our undersleeve.